like I mentioned, 9th straight session. When are we likely to see this bear run come to an end? What are your thoughts on the factors responsible for this?
Thanks, Wole. There are a couple of things that I feel are contributing to what's happening in the market. It's difficult to pinpoint any one of them. But I think one thing that we can't ignore is what's happening in Egypt.
Right.
Essentially, the market has been closed for about 5 weeks there. And the longer the delay in terms of the opening, the more investors are going to be a little bit anxious. If you consider that investors in Africa-focused funds are typically focused in 3 markets, that's Egypt, Nigeria, and then Kenya, in that order. What's essentially happening is the investors in some of these open-ended funds, where there's a bit of flexibility, are trying to exit those positions. So far as fund managers are unable to sell down in Egypt, they're going to be looking for other ways to generate some liquidity. Right. So that's why they're looking at Nigeria. So we've seen some increased selling pressure in this market, which has impacted the market negatively, as we've seen over the last 9 days. There are other things to consider as well. There's been a delay in the release of some of the bank results, and that's right. because of the unresolved issue between the CBN and the NASB. We believe that's coming to an end, so we should see some activity in terms of results towards the latter part of this week, next week as well. And there are several things as well. You can't ignore the fact that we're in an election year as well. So there's a little bit of apprehension, particularly from foreign investors as well. And lastly, what's happening in terms of exchange rates. I think there's a little bit of uncertainty as to the direction of exchange rates. We all recognize that exchange rates are coming under immense pressure. However, our view, if we're allowed to share, is basically that we maintain our outlook in respect of the exchange rates being fairly stable. And that's because of 2 things which you can't ignore, which is, first of all, the international oil prices, which are at $120 per barrel, and also the stance of the CBN, who has said that he will maintain exchange rates within a fixed bandwidth of the US dollar.
And of course, they said if they wouldn't make any change, they would announce it.
Exactly.
Right. Okay, but obviously one thing that many are pointing to as a catalyst for the market going forward is the bank results, which you just mentioned. Sure. You're definitely allowed to share on this. What are your expectations for those results in general?
Okay. Generally speaking, if we can just talk about the key, I guess, stories, the theme over what's happened in 2010 in the banking sector. Definitely we'll see growth in terms of earnings year on year, and that's really because of the declining provisioning levels. So in terms of core banking activities, we're likely to see that decline across board. And the key factors to that is that in terms of credit creation, that slowed down significantly in 2010, and also yields were down throughout most of the year as well. So the combination of those things would have affected banks from the top line in terms of their interest income and also their net interest margins. So we're likely to see core banking activity decline year on year. That said, yeah, sorry.
Okay, that's fine. Thanks for that point. But obviously another issue that is, should I say, plaguing the banking sector, or should I say is looming over the banking sector, if I use that phrase, is the expectations of M&A activity.
Sure.
How does, in your view, that whole development change the playing field for banking in Nigeria?
I think in terms of the news we've heard to date, and again, it's very high level. We haven't got the detail behind some of these announcements. It's our understanding there are about 6 banks in M&A processes. Last week, 2 of those banks entered into an MOU with their prospective investors, and we're expecting announcements this week as well as next week. And critically, it's the 5 sort of systemically important banks that are entering into deals or have advanced to this stage, which is positive for the sector because it's likely to instill some level of stability in the sector, and some of the uncertainty or what has been hanging over the sector in terms of a systemic risk would have diminished as a result of these announcements. Again, until we get full clarity in terms of exactly what those deals are, then it's really difficult for us to see that triggering any sort of rally in the market yet, because investors really don't know what they're buying yet.
Right.